Hello, and welcome to another episode of the DVD Graveyard, where we talk pretty much all horror all the time. Tonight, we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite horror movies of all time, Reanimator from 1985, or as it's titled on the actual case and on the title screen, H.P. Lovecraft's Reanimator, because it is based on the short story that H.P. Lovecraft wrote in the early 1900s. I have read the story Herbert West Reanimator. A long time ago, I read it, and the movie is quite different. I mean, of course, it takes the key elements from the story, but this one is more, of course, it's more modernized. But I really like the take they did with it, and they bring more, from the story into the sequels, because this movie does have, I think, 3 sequels, if I'm not mistaken, or I'm sorry, 2 sequels. But this is by far the best one. I know that there's Bride of Reanimator.
What have you done in here?
We created a life.
And Beyond Reanimator.
Oh God, it's you! You and your sick experiments!
But this one is by far the best of the best. So before I forget, I'm gonna read the plot synopsis off the back of the case real quick. Deep within the morgue at Miskatonic University, madman Herbert West, Jeffrey Combs, introduces fellow graduate student Dan Kane, Bruce Abbott, to his formula for the reanimation of fresh corpses. But the secret of life and death has some very messy consequences. Get ready to experience one of the most outrageously inventive, over-the-top classic horror films of all time. I feel like that's a very good synopsis of the movie. It doesn't give anything away, but it really just gives you the bare bones, and it's true. This is absolutely a all-time classic horror movie. I think everyone should see it. I don't usually say this in my videos, but if you want to avoid spoilers, this movie has been out for a very long time, but if you haven't seen it, absolutely go watch it right now. Just turn this off, go watch it now, and thank me later, because it is such an excellent movie. I'll give a brief kind of backstory of me with this movie. So I have a friend who, he's probably listening to this right now, first introduced this movie to me, long time, over 10 years ago. I went to his house, we used to hang out all the time, and I remember we went into the bedroom, and when we sat down to actually watch it, we ended up pausing it because his dad came in the room for one reason or another, and we just started talking, and we were just sitting there bullshitting until like 5 o'clock in the morning, and this movie just sat on pause the whole night, and we ended up not watching it and falling asleep. So I didn't get to watch it then, and when I finally did sit down to watch it by myself, it really blew me away. I was like, holy shit, this movie is amazing. Why didn't we watch this the other night? This is great. And ever since, I've been hooked on it. And this is really my introduction to, Stuart Gordon. This is the movie that really brought him to my attention. And of course, at the time, I didn't even know who Stuart Gordon was. I didn't know, kind of the history behind this movie. As I said, this movie is directed by Stuart Gordon. This is actually his first feature film. He comes from a background of plays, so this is really the movie that he kind of cut his directing teeth on. This is what he learned, how to direct a film. The director of photography that was brought in really had a big hand in teaching Stuart Gordon, what to do, when to do it, don't do this here, we're going to do this later, etc. He really kind of walked him through it. Stuart was very thankful for that. And this is all is in the special features of this Blu-ray copy I have, and it's really worth a watch to watch, what all went into this movie and the love that went into this movie. And so this was released by Empire Pictures, which, was a company run by Charles Band at the time, and it was produced by Brian Usna. And, speaking of Charles Band actually gets a lot of credit for this movie. Like, when I see a lot of people on YouTube, when they say best, Charles Band films, etc., or when they're talking about, Charles Band films or things that he's produced, he gets a lot more credit for this movie. But from what I understand, Charles didn't actually put a single penny in this movie at all. I don't even think his name is in the credits, from what I remember, but kind of got the locations for them. He recruited, of course, that director of photography that we were talking about, who really helped Stuart Gordon through all of this. Nothing against Charles Band. Charles Band's a great guy, and, he has done a lot for a lot of directors, but, like I said, I just feel like he gets a lot more credit than he really had a hand in, to be honest with you. So Now, Richard Band did do the music to this movie, so there, he isn't, of course, he did the music for Puppet Master, Demonic Toy, basically almost every full moon movie. Not all of them, but a lot of them he did, the music for. We'll talk more about the music here in just a little bit because it's got great music in it. This movie stars always great Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West, Bruce Abbott as Dan Kane, Barbara Crampton, who is beautiful as ever, plays Megan Halsey, Robert Sampson, who plays her father, Dean Halsey, and then David Gale, who plays Dr. Carl Hill. And we also get Carolyn Purdy Gordon, which is Stuart Gordon's wife. She plays a minor role in this movie. And she, pops up in a few of his other films, which we'll get into. This movie starts out at a university in Switzerland, and basically, it's some police and a nurse. They're coming down the hall, and we hear this screaming kind of off screen. And they come to this door, and they're pounding on the door, Herr Dr. Gruber, they're trying to, find out what's going on the other side of this door, and when they finally, they break into the door, and that's when we meet Herbert for the first time. Herbert West looks up and he's holding, the empty syringe, and Dr. Gruber is rolling around on the ground and freaking out, and that's whenever he sits up, and we get this excellent shot of Dr. Gruber's eyes are just pulsating, and he's, freaking out, making all these crazy sounds, and his eyes explode, and it's so great. It's such a excellent opening to a film. I mean, I cannot say that enough. This is the way to open up a movie. But so when they start, they are, accusing Herbert of killing, Dr. Gruber, and he says, "I didn't kill him. I gave him life," and so after that we kind of fade out, and that's when we get the opening credit sequence, and we hear the Richard Band score. Which, when I first watched this, of course, everyone, I'm sure everyone's thoughts were this, but when you first hear that score, you're like, this is the Psycho theme song. This is a straight ripoff of the Psycho music. Sorry, dogs are barking again. And it wasn't until years later I found out that this was actually completely intentional, and this was done not as a ripoff, but as a tribute to the score in Psycho. And I mean, it sounds very close. It's got a drum beat behind it, and it sounds a little bit more hip, I guess is the word you would say. But it's great, and it really fits what's going on in the movie so well. I mean, it works excellent. They really couldn't have picked a better score for this movie. So, even with all the backlash that Richard Band got for it sounding so much like the Psycho theme, I think it works perfectly fine. I could not imagine this movie with any different music whatsoever other than what we have. And so we get this excellent opening sequence with the music, and we're seeing all these really great shots of of bodies, from medical books and things, and there's a lot of greens and pinks and blues, and it's just such a fun opening sequence. And so after we get through this, the opening titles, the opening credits, that's whenever we are taken to Miskatonic University, which Miskatonic University comes up a lot in H.P. Lovecraft, lore, and there's a lot of that in here. There's a lot of tribute to H.P. Lovecraft, in this movie. A lot of, I guess you could say, H.P. Lovecraft Easter eggs in there. Stuart Gordon was a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft, and I mean, I am too. I love H.P. Lovecraft. Everything the man ever wrote was amazing. So that's whenever we, like I said, we get to Miskatonic, and that's where we meet Dan Kane, played by Bruce Abbott, and he is trying to revive a woman who is laying on the table, and he's sitting there and he's doing the chest compressions, and then we see Carolyn Purdy Gordon, who's there with him, and she's Dan, we need to stop. And he says, we just need some more time for the drugs to kick in. She'll come back. And she's like, a good doctor knows when to quit.
It's touching, but a waste of time. A good doctor knows when to stop.
That's when they finally, they kind of give in. They wrap the body up, and then Dan takes the corpse down to the morgue. As he's going down to the morgue, that's whenever we meet the security guard. I did not write his name down. I'm sorry, but we get to the morgue and the security guard is under there, and we see that Dan and him kind of have some have sort of a relationship, because he's done this several times. He's a doctor, so they're kind of just bullshitting like, oh yeah, I got another one for the freezer, and of course the security guards, I don't know, why they keep locked doors in here.
Nobody wants in, and ain't nobody getting out.
Once he goes in the morgue and he puts the body in the freezer, that's when we meet Dr. Hill, who is using his surgical drill, or a laser drill, I guess I should say, and he's performing a lobotomy. And this is when we meet Dean Halsey for the first time, and he kind of scares Dan, who's focused on this laser drill. He kind of just spooks him, and he introduces him to Herbert West.
Herbert West.
And he says he came from the university in Switzerland. He studied under Dr. Gruber, and this is when we really meet Herbert for the first time. Jeffrey Combs was, I think, born to play this part. He does such a fantastic job in this role. I could watch Jeffrey Combs play Herbert West forever. I mean, he does such an excellent job as the character of Herbert West. And, of course, when he meets him, you can see he's really kind of dry. And, he asks, Dan reaches out to shake his hand. And he says, you studied under Dr. Gruber. What did you study? And Herbert's, death. And he kind of moves away and he goes to kind of watch, look at the corpse that Dr. Hill was working on. And, by this time, Dr. Hill has gotten up and he, approaches Dean Halsey and Dan, and that is whenever he is introduced to Herbert West. And, of course, you can tell that there's kind of some beef going on between Herbert and Dr. Hill. And he's basically, West tells him, your work with brain death, the 12-minute, brain death theory is, laughable. It's very interesting, I think is what he says. And he says in Europe, it's very close to Dr. Gruber's work. In Europe, it's even considered plagiarism, So you can tell that there's some hostility going on between the two of them. And it's just really funny, the way Jeffrey Combs talks down to Dr. Hill's character. Dr. Hill as the, David Gale as Dr. Hill. It's just really funny the way that, because he's this young guy and he's really treating him like shit. And he's, you can tell that he thinks he's the smartest man in the room because he probably is. So I love that scene. That is so funny. And then of course when he says the thing about the 12-minute brain death theory, that's when Dr. Hill's 6 to 12 minutes, he's correcting him and getting in his ass about it. And of course Herbert's like, okay, whatever, dude. So anyway, we go from there to the basically to a, I guess, a tack board is what you would call it, in the hallway of this school, where Dan is posting a what do you want to call it? I guess a flyer. He's posting like a, back in the day, when you needed somebody to room with, you would post like a sticky note or something on a, on this board with your phone number and all the information. And that way, if somebody was looking for, a place to rent and a place to stay, they could call you and they could come and stay with you. And of course, the address is 666 Darkmoor, which again is another H.P. Lovecraft, Easter egg in there, which I thought was really cool. Something that, little things like that you wouldn't even really catch, in there. So that's when, we meet Megan Halsey, who is played by Barbara Crampton, and they kind of meet each other in the hallway, and Dan's kind of picking on her, and he's kind of biting her on the neck a little bit, and they're playing around and fooling around, and she's, no, Dan, no, and then we immediately cut to them having sex in the bed, and she's, yes, oh my God, and it's such an awesome transition. It's so funny, but that really kind of shows us the relationship between Dan and Megan. And so when they're laying in bed, Dan has this cat named Rufus, and it jumps on top of Dan and Megan while they're laying in the bed, and they kind of toss him to the side. And a funny little side note too, by the way, Behind them in the bed where they're doing it, there's a poster of, a Talking Heads poster, which is really funny. It's kind of a funny sort of foreshadowing thing, for later on in the movie. We'll get into it, of course. And so as Megan's getting ready to leave, they're kind of talking, the minute you graduate, I'll marry you. They don't want Dean Halsey to find out that they're screwing around because they don't want anything to happen to Dan, anything to happen with his grant or his student loan, I should say. So they're trying to kind of keep it a secret, but so they start kind of playing around and stuff and being goofy, and that's when Dan, he sits up in bed with this sheet over him, and he's chasing Megan around the apartment, and like no one would convict Dr. Dan, and I think all this was ad-libbed, if I'm not mistaken. They just kind of did this on a whim, which I think it's great. And the relationship between Barbara Crampton and Bruce Abbott is excellent. Their chemistry works fantastically in this movie. I think that they make a very believable couple in this movie. So he chases her kind of through the apartment, and that's when she goes to the front door and opens it, and she's startled because Herbert West is standing there. And, I'd love to open my door and see Jeffrey Combs stand there. I'd be like, oh my God, come in, sir. Please come in. Like, I have to ask you so many questions about everything, So, again, I love Jeffrey Combs. He's such an excellent actor. You'll learn that, more you stick around here. But Jeffrey Combs is great. And, Dan's kind of embarrassed. He takes the sheet off of him, and he's like, oh goodness, what are you doing here? Didn't we meet earlier? You're Herbert West? And he says, yes, just Herbert, and that's whenever he tells him that he's there for the apartment to rent. And this scene always cracks me up too, because again, Jeffrey Combs' line delivery is so awesome. So Dan leaves to go, change and go put some clothes on, and Megan Halsey, or just Meg, I don't know why I said her full name. Megan lets Herbert into the apartment, shuts the door behind him, and he's, this is so funny. One of my favorite lines of the movie, for one of them. It's just the way he says it. He says, "I startled you," and Megan's like, "Yes," and then Jeffrey Combs goes, It's just so funny. He's just so dry and just so smug. And I used to hate him, honestly. I did not like, when I first watched this, I did not like the character of Herbert West, because I just thought he was a very, like I said, the smartest guy in the room. He's, very, what's the word for it? I don't know. I just did not like his character. He's very smug, but he really grew on me after a while. And I'm like, if you were as intelligent as, Herbert West in this story, you'd have every right to be this way. So, of course, he comes in, and Dan's kind of showing him, around the apartment, and he's, asking him all these questions, and Herbert just kind of stops him. Yes, does this building have a basement? And so they take him down to the basement, and, of course, he's super excited. He's like, yes, this will do just fine. May I move in now? My things are outside. And he pulls out a wad of cash and tries to hand it to Dan. And, of course, Megan's kind of hesitant about it. She's like, I don't know about this. I don't know. You have a lot to discuss. And then, of course, Herbert, he doesn't give a damn about, anything Meg says. And he's, do we have a deal? Do we have a deal? And he, tries to hand him the money. Dan accepts. And, and of course, Megan is disappointed. And he tells him, you'll never even know I'm here, except, of course, at the first of the month, And so he's so great. And again, Jeffrey Combs, such a great actor. And, of course, Bruce Abbott and Jeffrey Combs have great chemistry together in this movie, too. Everyone's acting is phenomenal in this whole movie. I just figured I would touch on that just in case I forget. So, anyway, of course, like I said, he accepts him, he moves in. That's whenever we get to our first class, which is taught by Dr. Hill. And Dr. Hill is basically removing a brain from a human body. And, the whole class is there. And as Dr. Hill is kind of explaining, the brain can only survive an additional 6 to 12 minutes. 6 to 12 minutes, and he looks at Herbert West, and he's like, we all have these fantasies of some afterlife where we will keep our consciousness and move on, but death is the end. And then Herbert snaps one of his pencils, and you can tell this really pisses off Dr. Hill, and he looks at him, And then, of course, Dr. Hill goes on, and he's talking some more, and Herbert snaps another pencil right in the middle of him talking, and that really bugs Dr. Hill, and he's stops, and he's like, "We will discuss the location of the human will at another time, Mr. West. I suggest you get yourself a pen," and that's another really funny. This movie's really funny, by the way, as well. I forgot to mention that there's a lot of comedy, especially if you're into darker comedy. This movie is full of it. But he tells him, I suggest you get yourself a pen," and that's when Herbert gets up and he starts going off, and he's like, you're teaching these people dribble. They deserve. You're closing their minds before they even have a chance to open. To experience anything, and blah blah blah, and you should have stolen more of Gruber's ideas, because then you would at least have ideas, And that's his whole thing is, of course, he says that he's plagiarized a lot of, Dr. Gruber's work, which, of course, we'll find out more about his plagiarism ways later on in the movie. And so, like I said, he kind of, antagonizes him, Dr. Hill kind of snaps at him, in the middle, as they're leaving the class, "Mr. West, it is going to be a pleasure to fail you." And then, they all leave, and, he kind of tries to keep his composure, down a little bit. So, next scene, we get to, there's Dean Halsey, Dr. Hill, and Megan are all sitting down at dinner, at Dean Halsey's house. He was invited to it earlier on in the film we saw. And so they're all sitting down and eating, and, they're trying to get Megan to drink some wine, and she's like, "Well, no, Dan is going to pick me up soon, and, I don't want to drink or anything like that, or I'm not going to be here very long, is what I should say." And so that's when Dr. Hills kind of acts a little weird. He's like, "Oh, you and Kane, huh? What's kind of going on there?" And then, of course, that's when Dan kind of interrupts the situation, and he comes in and picks him up, and Dr. Hills kind of being weird, and he's like, why don't you study here? Why do you excuse me, why do you have to go to your place, and blah blah, just asking all these questions and being kind of nosy about it. And he's like, I'll have her back by midnight, I promise. So he's kind of got his suspicions, and as they leave, that's when Dr. Hill, we get the first kind of kind of taste of how weird Dr. Hill is, and kind of how he feels towards Megan, and he proposes a toast as they go. And, he says something along the lines of, "Everyone who's crossed her path has been enchanted by her, her unwavering beauty." So he makes this weird comment, and of course they're just kind of like, "Oh, okay," and then they leave. And like I said, that's kind of our first, sort of, feel, that's when we're kind of feeling out Dr. Hill. We know something kind of weird is going on here. He's got the hots for Megan. I mean, who wouldn't have the hots for Barbara Crampton? She was so beautiful. So yeah, they leave, and then back at Dan's apartment, they're sitting there trying to actually study. Of course, Dan is kind of trying to put the moves on Megan, and she's a little creeped out because she's like, West is always, he's always in his room. Rufus doesn't like him. Rufus always runs and hides when West comes around, and Dan is like, he's a little weird, but there's nothing wrong with him. Blah blah blah, and she's like, well, come to think of it, I haven't seen Rufus the whole time we've been here. Usually he's all over us when we're together. And so that's when they both start kind of looking all over the house for Rufus. They're calling him, and they can't find him, and Megan goes into Herbert's room, and that's when she goes over to a little mini fridge he has in the corner of the room, and opens it up, and there is Rufus in the refrigerator, and he's dead. And West catches her, and I meant to say this too. That's when we really see the reagent for the first time, which is really neat. They used the stuff that's in the glow sticks, so it's just this bright, glowing green, stuff in this jar in the refrigerator, and it looks so cool. It's got, it screams mad scientist, kind of vibes. It's just really neat. I'm glad they went with that for the reagent. It's really cool. So that's the first time we really see the reagent in the fridge. And of course, West catches her in the room, and they as they come in, and he and of course Dan sees the cat, and Megan's freaking out. Oh, he killed the cat! He killed the cat! And that's when West just kind of explains it away. He's like, I found him like that. He got his head stuck in a jar after he knocked over the trash, in the kitchen. I didn't want you to find it like that. And then of course Dan's like, you could have left a note, or you could have called. And he's like, well, I was busy, as hauling bodies around in the morgue. What would a note say? Sorry, Dan, cat dead. Details later. It's so good, to hear that. And this is really the first time that we really, well, not the first time. There is an earlier scene in the movie I forgot to talk about, but Herbert is lying a lot, and it's really neat because when you go back and watch it again, like on first viewing, you may not really pick it up, but when you go back and watch, you really see how good, of a liar he is, and the way he's able to talk himself out of these situations. And it's great because, you never really know when he's telling the truth about anything. So that's awesome on a rewatch when you go back and you realize how much he's really been lying to everyone and how he's lied his way out. And we'll get confirmation, because at this point we don't know that he's lying. We don't know that. We've got, hints that he might have been, but we don't know for sure that he's, been lying to Dan this whole time. So anyway, I just thought that was a neat little tidbit that, I picked up on. So anyway, that's when, he's telling, Dan picks up the reagent, and he says, what is this? What is this? And Herbert, that's none of your damn business. And just like it's none of my business that you're sleeping with the dean's daughter, and that's when, Dan is like, I think that Dean Halsey will understand. And, Herbert gives that smart ass kind of smile to him. He's like, I don't know. You want to find out? So he's kind of blackmailing him in a way. So that's a great little scene. And then we flash forward to Dan waking up in the middle of the night because he hears these awful sounds coming from the basement. And so he gets up and he's looking around the apartment. He's got a baseball bat and he's kind of looking around the apartment, seeing what's going on. And he's looking for Herbert, and he can't find him anywhere. And then that's whenever he smashes through the basement door because, of course he hears this noise, and he goes down there and, I guess he doesn't go down there. More like he falls down there. And we see Herbert is being attacked by a cat. It's on his back. Rufus, is attacking him and going crazy. And Herbert's trying to throw it off of him. And he's like, get it off. And so he ends up getting it off of his back, and they're chasing it all throughout the room, and they're fighting. They're trying to kill this thing. And this is a really neat scene too, because you hear everyone say talk about the cat scene in this movie. But if you really watch closely, and I don't know if it's just on this Blu-ray or if it's noticeable on the DVD, but you never see the cat. There's just a lot of stuff kind of flying around the room, and of course there's a swinging light at the top of the room. So sometimes the screen's black and then it's lit, and then it's black and it's lit as this light swings back and forth. Excellent cinematography. I mean, that was such a cool scene, just how, like, the way that they worked around that to where you don't really see, like I said, you don't see the cat, at all. And so I think that that's really cool, so if you go back and watch that, pay close attention. You don't actually see the cat at all until it finally comes out and attacks them. And then Dan gets a hold of it and they throw it against the wall and it's finally dead. And, we get this great looking little, practical effect, little cat that's all torn to shit and bleeding and it's twisted all backwards, and it looks awful. If you've got a fondness for cats, which I do, but if you have a fondness for cats, that might hit. But it's so fake looking, of course. I mean, it looks great, but I mean, it's obviously fake. But anyway, so they kill it, and that's whenever it gets on it's on the table, and Herbert is kind of explaining the reagent, and he's kind of telling him, if you just reactivate the cells in the brain, you can basically jumpstart life in this. And Dan is telling him, your theories are not new. This has been around for a long time. This theory. And he's like, yes, the theory is not, but my reagent is. And he tells him, he says, I'll show you that it works. I'll show you right now, and then you're going to help me. That's why I brought the infernal beast back to life in the first place. And Dan is, no, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see it. And he's like, yes, you will. I'll show you. And he's like, he wasn't dead. He wasn't dead at all. You just lowered his vital signs. You lowered his body temperature. He wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And, and this is another great scene, another line, Herbert, points at the dead cat and he's like, do you agree that it's dead now? And then he picks it up and he slams it down on the table. Do you agree? He's dead now. Excellent scene, or excellent little line in there. That I always thought that was so funny. Just the way he says that. And so that's whenever he injects the reagent into the brain of the cat, and the cat begins to wiggle and come back to life. And Dan is just blown away. He's like, oh my God. You can tell he's absolutely focused in on this. And Herbert's telling him, no, we can defeat death. This is every doctor's dream. We'll live lifetimes. We'll be famous. And you can tell that Dan is kind of getting into the idea of this. And then they are interrupted by Megan. She comes downstairs and she freaks out because she sees Rufus all bent in half on the table, and Dan kind of takes her out of the room and takes her away. And that's when Herbert is like, damn, it's, and just like somebody described in the special features on this movie, they said it's like two really nerdy science buddies who are really into something together, but the one has a girlfriend, so he can't really totally focus on work because he has to focus on the girlfriend as well. That was a really good, way to sum up this movie, or sum up that character, I suppose. So that's kind of the feeling you get. Herbert and Dan. If Dan was not, if he didn't have Barbara Crampton in his life, he would absolutely be a lot more focused on this. But and Herbert, like I said, wants to share his discovery and wants help, from Dan in this situation. So, anyway, that's when we cut to, there's a scene where Dan is telling Dean Halsey, about West's discovery. He's telling him, he has conquered brain death. He's brought this cat back to life, and he's kind of explaining it to Dean Halsey. Halsey doesn't want to hear it. He's like, I should have known you would start to lose your mind when you took up with someone like Herbert West, blah, 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 and just going off. And at the same time, I kind of want to tell Dan, I'm like, just take it up there, slap it on his desk, perform the reanimation, and he'll believe you. You know what I mean? He's got to see it to believe it. But he doesn't want to hear it, and he tells, he tells Dan that, basically, you're going to submit me a written apology tomorrow, and either way, your student loan will be rescinded, and as of now, Herbert West is expelled from Miskatonic University. So their whole kind of life comes crumbling down because, of course, by this point, Dean Halsey has put together the fact that, Dan and Megan are kind of screwing around, and he doesn't like that. Dr. Hill kind of put that seed in his mind. Which there's actually an interesting scene too. I'll mention this here because before this, when they're at the dinner, after Dan and Megan leave, there's a scene where Dean Halsey Dr. Hill hypnotizes Dean Halsey and basically tells him that, Dr. Kane is a piece of shit and he's bad and he's, he shouldn't be, he should really kind of, Dean Halsey should keep an eye on him. So that really explains why, Dean Halsey is so shitty to Dan whenever he comes back, because before that he loved Dan, he thought Dan was great, he had no problems with it, but now all of a sudden he just cannot stand him, and he just does not want to believe a word he has to say, even though he knows that he's a bright, very great doctor, or up and coming doctor, I should say. So that kind of explains that, but I'm kind of glad that they dropped that, because the hypnosis thing, I guess it's cool, but it doesn't really fit the whole plot. It was just something else that was kind of added onto it. I don't know, whatever you think, if you think it should have been added in there, then sure. Because he does do kind of a weird kind of hypnosis thing later on in the movie, which we'll touch on that too. But so that's kind of why Dean Halsey's being so shitty to Dan whenever, and he even tells him, you've involved Megan in this insanity, you piece of shit, you will not be around my daughter. What have you been doing with my daughter? So anyway, that's kind of, what's going on there. So then we cut to Dan is wheeling a corpse into the morgue. And we know that it's Herbert. We kind of get the idea, and we just see these feet kind of poking out of the sheet at the very bottom. And that's whenever he crosses, he passes the guard, to go into the morgue, and the guard stops him, and he's about to be busted. He's about to lift up the sheet, and he's like, you ain't got my lunch under there, do you? And of course, Dan stops him real quick, and he's, yeah, one meatball run over by a semi. And then he's like, I lost my appetite. You mind if I go take a break for a little while? And he says, sure. So the guard leaves. And then so they go into the morgue, and Herbert pulls the sheet off and he says meatball. It's really funny. Anyway, again, Jeffrey Combs, such a great actor, and their chemistry, Jeffrey Combs and Bruce Abbott, are so funny. It's so funny watching them together because they're like polar opposites in a way. They're two sides of the same coin, I guess you could say. Anyway, so when they get in there, this is another interesting scene too. Like I said, Jeffrey Combs is barefoot, and I think originally they didn't want Jeffrey Combs to be barefooted. I think they wanted him just to have his shoes on, but Jeffrey Combs suggested, that it would be more believable if he was barefoot. And he told, he told all of them, he said, I can put my shoes on fast enough that we can keep it in the scene. And, they're finally like, okay, Jeffrey, whatever. And so when we get into the morgue, he pulls the sheet off and he puts his shoes on super fast. And I think that's a really cool little touch that they left in there. And I'm glad that they added that, because it just makes it that much more believable, because of course, I guess if you saw, a corpse being wheeled into there with shoes on sticking out from underneath the sheet, they would know something was up. So when they're in there, they are kind of looking around, and they're looking through all the corpses, and one of them has a shotgun blast to the head. One of them is a burn victim. One of them is rotten, and that's when and of course Dan the whole time is freaking out. He just wants to get out of there because he's paranoid, and he doesn't want Dean Halsey to catch him down there. And so that's when they find one, apparently a John Doe, early to mid 20s, who just dropped dead in perfect physical condition. He's this big jacked dude who I think actually the guy who played this particular corpse, I think he used to be a stunt double for Arnold Schwarzenegger way back in the day on, like, I want to say Conan, but I don't know, I could be mistaken. So anyway, they find this corpse, and it's the freshest body that they've come across so far. And, Herbert's, any sign of reanimation will justify continuing, So that's when he injects, some of the serum into the corpse, into the brain of the corpse. And he doesn't know how much to add, so he adds a little bit more. And the whole time they're recording and they're trying to, like I said, record their results and everything that's going on. And in the meantime, that's when we see Dean Halsey comes into the hospital with Megan, and he goes to Carolyn Purdy Gordon, and he tells her that, is Dan Kane in this hospital anywhere? I said that he was to be suspended. He's not allowed here. He's gone. He's done. And so, they're like, that we didn't get the memo. So that's whenever he just goes and decides to go find him for himself, so he heads down to the morgue. So as he's going to the morgue, they're paging Dan to the security desk, and Dan's freaking out, and they're losing their mind, and Herbert's getting pissed because, the reagent isn't working, the corpse isn't coming back to life, and right as they're about to leave, the corpse raises up, and, he's foaming at the mouth and screaming and making all these horrible sounds. And that's when we get to this is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie, is this part in the freezer. I love this, or not even just the freezer, just in the morgue. Like, this is one of my favorite scenes of the whole movie. It's a lot of fun. So as the corpse, when the corpse gets up, he attacks Herbert and Dan, and he's throwing them around the room and beating them up and tossing them around. And so about that time, that's when Dean Halsey comes into the morgue, and he goes to the freezer door, and he's pounding on the door, and he's trying to get it open, and the corpse goes and he smashes down this huge steel freezer door, and it lands on top of Dean Halsey. He jumps on top of the door and squishes him down even further. Then he flips the door over, he grabs Dean Halsey, and he starts throwing him all over the room. He bites his fingers off, he's just slamming him into stuff. And then, Dan is trying to get this corpse off, this living corpse off of, of Dean Halsey. He's trying to save him. And so that's when Herbert, gets the bone saw that we see earlier in the brain examination scene, I guess you would say, when they were in the class with Dr. Hill. And we get this great effect where Jeffrey Combs grabs the corpse, around the throat. He kind of chokeholds him and then stabs the bone saw through the corpse's chest. And of course, it's a cheesy kind of effect. You can see it was, how it was done pretty much, especially on this Blu-ray. It's very clear. But it works so well, and it just adds to the tone of the movie. Or I guess it goes with the tone of the movie. I don't know, but it's very cheesy. A lot of the effects are very cheesy, but great. And there's so much blood. It is so violent. So after they kill this corpse, it falls down. And that's when Herbert kind of looks over at Dean Halsey, who is dead now. And, Dan is freaking out. And so, Herbert's pulling this body over and he's telling him, he's like, this is the freshest corpse we can come across besides killing one ourselves. We've got to do this. And Dan's freaking out and he tells him, he's Dan, we can bring him back to life. We can do this. So Dan helps him and puts him on the table. They inject the reagent into Dean Halsey's brain, and West is sitting there and he's checking the time, 5 seconds, 15 seconds, and he's counting down and he's screaming at the corpse, I'll show you, damn it, I'll show you. And then he slams his fist on the table, and as he does that, Dean Halsey's eyes open back up, and this is one of the best lines in the entire movie. It's not on a comical side, but on a more serious note, because this movie is really back and forth. It's very comical and it'll get really serious, and very comical, very serious. So it's really back and forth. He tells him, he gets in his ear and, he says, Dean Halsey, you did me a favor by letting me into Miskatonic University. Welcome back to life. And I love that, the way he says that, welcome back to life. And then, of course, Dean Halsey's still kind of in his mood to murder Dan and West. He grabs them both by the throat, and he's sitting there kind of strangling them. And that's when Megan interrupts. Megan comes through the morgue door. She's screaming, Daddy, get off of them, get off. And so Dean Halsey sees his daughter, and I guess his remnants that are still left over in his brain. He doesn't want his daughter to see him acting this way, and doesn't want to see him acting, like an animal, basically. So he runs and he goes and hides over in the corner, and he's hiding his face. And then about that time, that's when the security comes back around and, what the hell's going on? What's going on? And this is where we really confirm, a lot of Jeffrey Combs' lies, or Herbert West's lies, I guess, because, he fabricates the story. He says, Dean Halsey came in here and he was ranting and going off, and he, used this bone saw on this corpse, and he trashed the room, and, all this stuff. And he, like I said, he lied about all this. And that's when we're really kind of confirm, what's going on. And it's just so hectic, everything that's going on. And that's when Dan is kind of in shock, and he's laying down, and Herbert's trying to console him. So from this point, basically, really from the cat scene, to tell you the truth, this movie is unrelenting. Like it is just go constantly. Like the best way I describe it is this movie is about an hour and 26-ish minutes, something like that, but it feels like it's like 30 minutes. Like it goes by so fast because there's just constantly something going on, and I really appreciate that about this movie. Like it does not hold back. Like you are going full speed the whole time. Like I said, basically from the cat scene onward, it's just nonstop, in your face constantly. There's something to keep your attention going, and I love that about this movie. And a lot of Stuart Gordon films, there's just a lot of stuff that kind of keeps your attention the whole time. So like I said, after that happens, that's when we see Dr. Hill, and he's basically got Dean Halsey in a padded room in his office, and he's trying to comfort Meg, and he's, saying, I need to perform exploratory brain surgery on him to find out exactly what's going on. We don't know what the deal is, and all this. And, Megan signs this paperwork to allow Dean Halsey to do this exploratory surgery, like I said, to find out what's going on. And that's when Dr. Hill kind of gets creepy again. He's like, I want you to trust me, Megan, and then he says, if you ever need anything, or if you're ever lonely, and he gets real kind of close to her, and it's just really creepy, like I said, you can really tell he's got the hots for her. Again, who wouldn't? It's Barbara Crampton. She's so beautiful. She's still beautiful to this day, but I mean, in the 80s, just my God, Barbara Crampton was a goddess. And that's not to mention in From Beyond. My goodness, we'll talk about that one. We'll get to that later. But so anyway, she kind of shuts him down, and she leaves, and she's I'm gonna find out what happened to my daddy. And he gets pissed, and he punches the wall, and then he goes into the padded room with two nurses, and they grab Dean Halsey and they restrain him, and I guess they're gonna give him a sedative or something, for this surgery. So after that, that's when we go to see Dan. I think he's at his house or they're at Megan's house. I can't remember exactly, but Megan confronts him and she's angry, asking, what did you do to him? What did you do? And she slaps him in the face. And, Dan tells her, he's not mad. He's not crazy. He's dead, so he really kind of lays it down for her. He's like, it's true. I know it's true. He's dead. That's all there is to it. And so she's upset and she's crying and he kind of consoles her. And again, they have a really good relationship on screen. I wish Bruce. I don't know if they've done more any other roles together, but Bruce Abbott and Barbara Crampton have really great chemistry. At least on screen, they do anyway. So I think that worked really well for this. And it was cast very well, I should say. Which, funny enough, well, no, I'll talk about that. I'll talk about that later. So, that's when we go back to Dan's apartment, and we're in the basement with Herbert West, who's working on his reagent some more, and Dr. Hill confronts West, and he basically tries to blackmail him, and he wants to steal his serum. He's telling him, let me, and he tells Herbert, he's like, you're brilliant. The work, the work that you've done based off of Dr. Gruber's work, is phenomenal. Like, this is absolutely brilliant. And he's, like I said, he blackmails him, tells him that he'll lock him up for a murderer or lock him up for a madman because that him and he and West both know that there's nothing mentally wrong with Dean Halsey. He's dead. So that's when like I said, he's looking at the serum, and Herbert kind of gives in, and he's showing him and kind of telling him everything about the serum, how the serum works and everything. And Dr. Hill's, I will be famous for this, for my discovery, my serum. He's already taken credit. So we that's when we really see that Dr. Hill really has been plagiarizing, like Dr. Gruber's work and things like that. So that's kind of our confirmation on that. And like I said, that's when you really realize he is, besides him just being creepy with Megan, he really is a big piece of shit in this movie, and it pisses you off so much. And that's another thing too, is this point kind of marks the turn, because in the very beginning of the movie, the very first half of the movie, West is the villain. He's the bad guy in this movie. He's been lying, he's been stealing and doing these horrible experiments on animals and people and all these other things, and it kind of shifts to Dr. Hill is now the villain. So I thought that was really interesting too, because as you go on further in this movie, Herbert West starts to kind of become one of the heroes. And then, of course, poor, Dan Kane is just stuck in the middle of all this and having to deal with it, the best he can. So, at this point, Herbert smashes Dr. Hill over the head with a shovel. Dr. Hill drops to the ground, and Herbert decapitates him, which this is an excellent shot, an excellent effect that they use on this. It's just a cutout shovel, to go around Dr. Hill's neck, or David Gale's neck, I should say. And he's sitting there, and he lops off his head. So much blood, so violent, but it's great. I love it. Like I said, the effect looks phenomenal. And so at that point, Herbert picks up Dr. Hill's head, and he sits it in this tray on his desk, and it won't sit up straight. It keeps falling over. So that's when West grabs one of those. It's like one of them spiky things that you keep on a desk to put like sticky notes and stuff on. He pulls all the sticky notes off that, and he slams Dr. Hill's head down on that so it will stand up straight, which is really funny too. That just cracks me the hell up. And so as Herbert is looking at this head in this tray, he says, parts. I've never done whole parts before. And that's when you really kind of see it click. So he injects the reagent into the severed head and into the body, that's laying on the floor. And so a little bit of time kind of goes by. And of course, like I said, this movie's just getting so hectic. There's so much shit just going on, and just so much crazy shit going on. And it's just so... Like I said, that's the best word for it, is hectic. Like, this movie is very stressful, very hectic, because stuff just keeps adding up, and getting worse for as they go on. So very great, very, great time. So anyway, Herbert is sitting there, and he's kind of tapping, Dr. Hill's head with this pencil, and then all of a sudden the eyes open up, and Herbert's super excited, and he's taking notes, and he says, Dr. Hill, can you hear me? And that's when Dr. Hill, the head looks at him and says, West. And this is a great effect too, because it's literally just a like steel pan with a hole cut out in it with David Gale's head shoved up through the bottom, and it looks so good, and it's fairly convincing, and it works very well for the movie. To be honest with you, it's really not. It's pretty cheesy, but it works. It works great. I couldn't imagine seeing this in 1985. I bet it was mind blowing. So, he's like, yes, this is, it's Herbert West, what, can you say something? And he says, you, and then Herbert, okay, you, and he writes it down, and then he goes, bastard. And then the body comes up, Dr. Hill's body comes up behind Herbert and slams his head down on the table and knocks him unconscious. And it's such a great scene. I love that, so much. And so that's when we kind of go to I'm sorry, Dr. Hill. That's who I'm trying to say. We kind of cut to Dr. Hill's office, and Megan and Dan are kind of looking around, just kind of trying to find some more information on what happened to Megan's father. And she kind of goes in there, and she wants to talk to him, and she tries to, and of course he turns around and he's been lobotomized. Dr. Hill didn't perform any surgery, he just lobotomized him is all he did. So at this same time, when she's in there trying to get through to her father, Dan finds in the filing cabinet this creepy file over Megan. There's pictures and a piece of clothing and a piece of her hair in there and newspaper articles about Megan. So it's really creepy, and that's when we confirm that, yes, there really is something disturbing going on. Dr. Hill's got this weird kind of fantasy, creepy, weird thing going on for, Megan. And that's, like I said, that kind of confirms it. And so after this, Dan... we go back to Dan's apartment, and he confronts Herbert, and he's the laboratory is trashed. Like I said, Herbert West wakes up, and the whole lab has been destroyed, and in the basement, and all of his notes have been taken, his serum has been taken, and that's when Dan kind of confronts him, and he said, "Oh, what's going on?" And he says, "Dr. Hill stole my work. I had to kill him." And Dan freaks out, and he's like, "What the hell? This has got to stop. You're losing your mind." And that's when West lays it down. He's like, he tried to blackmail me, and he wanted you to disappear, which is a lie, because he didn't say anything about, Dan really wanting to disappear. Not that I remember, but, so he kind of manipulates Dan in this. And, that's kind of what this goes into, is he's manipulating him this whole movie. And, so that's whenever, Dan kind of lays it down and tells him, he found this weird, creepy file, and he's got some kind of weird obsession, over Megan. And then Jeffrey Combs does this really funny laugh at this scene, and it really cracks me up. It's, again, Jeffrey Combs, such a great actor. So that's when we go back to Hill's office, and Hill's body is carrying, how he got here, I don't know. I guess he just walked, but Hill's body is carrying the head in a tray. And sometimes it's a dummy head. Sometimes it's it's his actual head, in close-ups. It worked really well. They did really well with this. And the body puts a little bit more reagent in the head, and the body's funny too, because it's kind of fumbling around and trying to find the stuff, and Hill's head is just kind of rolling his eyes at what's going on. And so that's when the body picks up Hill's head, and he walks over to the two-way mirror, with Dean Halsey on the other side. And that's when we kind of get a, semblance, or we see kind of some of this hypnosis, I guess. I'm using, air quotes here. But that's when we see some of this in a hypnosis, and he tells him, it's time for you to come out, and it's this really cool kind of weird projection thing, and we see, Dean Halsey looking through the two-way mirror, and we see the hands holding the head, and he's talking to him through this mirror, and it's done so well, and it looks so good. it's great. I love this part. Love this movie. It's got this really interesting just vibe about it, and it's really funny at the same time, just seeing him holding this head, and the head just talking to it's so funny. Cracks me up. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say this movie's funny and it's great like a million times, and reference how good of an actor Jeffrey Combs is a million times, but I don't care. Damn it, I love this movie, and I hope you love it too. So anyway, after that's when Hill's body. This scene is really funny too. Hill's body. Okay, let me preface this. In Dr. Hill's office, there's like this plastic head, that's half got the human side on it, and then the other half is the inside anatomy. It's got the skull, the eyeball, the brain. It's something that they use, I guess, as a reference to kind of show what they're going to do. Insert, I don't know. It's one of those science, kind of plastic science dummies that has the organs inside of it, but it's a head. And so we see it earlier in the movie, and then we get this scene of the body. Dr. Hill's body has this fake head with a surgical mask over his face, and he's carrying the head in like a doctor's bag, and he's kind of just shuffling along this wall, with the human side facing the security desk. It's so funny. And as he's about to go into the morgue, an ear falls off of this head, and the security guards, is that you, Dr. Hill? And then you hear muffled, yes, it's me, from the bag. And it's so fucking funny. I can't even. Please watch this movie. It's hilarious. So that really cracks me up. And then so as Dr. Hill, the body carries Dr. Hill in there. This is funny too, because the security guard's sitting there looking at like a boudoir magazine, and he kind of looks around and closes the magazine up, and he's like, time for a break. So he's going to masturbate. He's going to go in there and jerk off in the bathroom or something, because he's been sitting here looking at porn all night. So that's pretty funny too. So anyway. That's when Dan, he goes to check on Meg at her house, and he's kind of consoling her, and he's like, I'm so sorry, and she's telling him, you should move away, you need to go away. She's basically more or less breaking up with him, and she's telling him, I wish I could hate you. I tried to hate you. I want to hate you, but I can't. I love you, and they kind of make up, and they smooch and all this other stuff, and then of course that's when the door is smashed in, and it's Dean Halsey, and he pushes Dan out of the way. Dan is knocked unconscious, and he kidnaps Meg, and he takes Meg back to the morgue. And so inside the morgue, that is when we see that Hill is lobotomizing all these corpses, and he's using that laser surgical drill. And, of course, the head in the pan is just watching the body do this. Again, it's very comical. And, at the same time he's doing this, Herbert wakes up, goes and wakes Dan up, and, tells him, we need to go, and we need to go to the hospital. He's kidnapped Meg. We need to do all this. Or, I'm sorry, Dan says this to Herbert. So they leave. And about that time, like I said, back in the morgue, I kind of got that a little bit out of order, but back at the morgue, Hill is in there doing his thing, and that's when Dean Halsey brings my God, well, they just took off running. Dean Halsey brings Meg's body back into the morgue, and he lays her down on the table, and they tie her up and strip her completely naked, which, Barbara's so fine. They strip her completely naked, and this is funny too, because the first time I saw this movie, I did not expect Barbara, again, didn't know who Barbara Crampton was, hadn't really seen her in anything, but I did not expect her to be completely naked in this movie, but she is, thank the movie gods. She's so beautiful, she's very well put together, and so as she's, tied up on this, she's unconscious, and she's tied up on this tray, the corpse, the body, Dr. Hill's body is kind of groping on her tits and stuff and feeling on her body. And he picks up, about that time, Megan wakes up, she's screaming. And it's so funny. This again is pretty humorous, but it's disturbing, as hell. Dr. Hill, the body grabs the head and he starts moving it down towards her crotch. And and he's about to basically go down on her. Again, this scene is, comically, referred to, or classically referred to, I guess you could say, whatever, as the head gives head. So he's about to, kind of, go down on her with his severed head, which again is just a hilarious visual. And as this happens, he's interrupted by Dan and Herbert, and he's well, no, I'm sorry. Herbert comes in the front, and we see Dan kind of coming in the back, and Herbert kind of confronts him, and he tells him, you think you can really just steal my discovery and get away with it? Who's gonna believe? And this is another one of my favorite lines in the movie. He tells him, you think you can? Who's gonna believe a talking head anyway? Get a job at a sideshow. And that's so funny, just the way Jeffrey Combs delivers that. It just that gets a chuckle out of me every time he says that. Get a job at a sideshow. So funny. I want to get that on a shirt. That'd be so funny. So anyway, in the background, that's when we see Dan. He basically releases Barbara, or Megan, I should say. He releases her from the restraints, and Dr. Hill is telling him, I can't believe you've made such a fatal mistake. And, Herbert tells him, oh, I have a plan. And Dr. Hill's, I too have a plan. And then at that same time, all the corpses in the morgue raise up and start raising hell. And they start attacking everything and everyone. And, it's a great, very great little jump scare, and we see all the corpses from the movie that we had heard about earlier, and the shotgun wound, the burn victim, all this good stuff. So they all come up, and they're just tearing the room apart, and they grab Herbert and they go to lay him down on the table, and Dr. Hill is trying to lobotomize Herbert. He's got the laser drill on his head, or against his head, and as all the corpses are attacking Megan and Dan, and that's when Megan, she looks at Dean Halsey and she's like, "Oh, Daddy, it's me," and finally she breaks through to him, and he gets all the corpses off of Dan and Megan. He's fighting them all off, and so he runs over and he pushes Dr. Hill's body out of the way, and he grabs Dr. Hill's head, which inadvertently saves Herbert. So Herbert gets off the table. Halsey grabs the head and crushes it in his hands, which is a great scene. Again, a great little effect. He just smashes it and throws it against the wall, and it splatters. About this time, the security guard comes back and sees what's happening. He just leaves because he's like, "Fuck this shit, I'm out. I'm gonna go call the police." So he takes off. So Hill is no more. Hill is dead. Then Herbert tells, they're trying to get out of here. And at this point, like I said, without their master, because what Dr. Hill's plan was, is of course he lobotomized all these corpses so that they would listen to him and they would follow his orders. And so with him out of the way, now all the corpses are just losing their mind, and they're just breaking everything. They're smashing stuff, ripping electrical parts out of the, out of the wall, breaking lights, throwing stuff. It's just it's crazy. It's going nuts. And that's when Herbert, he tells Dan, he's like, I told you I had a theory, and he grabs two, full syringes of the reagent, and he screams, "Overdose!" And then he sticks it in Dr. Hill's body and injects both of the full syringes into the body. So the body freaks out, it falls over into the corner, and then the chest explodes, and all the intestines come out of the body, and they wrap Herbert up, and they start pulling him towards the body. And that's when Dan is trying to help Herbert. He's got him, he's grabbing his hand, and he's trying to get him, and Herbert says, "My notes," and he throws him the notes and the reagent, because he's more concerned about his discovery than himself. And so they, Dan and Megan are trying to escape, and of course the living corpses are still grabbing onto them and trying to stop them. Dean Halsey breaks them up. He goes over and fights all the corpses off, and this is when we get another great scene. So as Herbert's being dragged out of screen, by these living intestines, the room is really dark, and we get this kind of white light, and in the middle of this, we see the corpses tear Dean Halsey apart. Like, they rip his head off, one of them rips his arm off, the other one rips his leg off. It's so cool. Like, you don't see it clearly, but it's a really cool scene. It's all done in silhouette, and it just looks amazing. Like I said, they just rip him to pieces, and that's so cool, so badass. So Megan and Dan are able to escape. They take off, with his notes and the reagent, and they get in this elevator. And as they're in the elevator, the burn victim reaches in and attacks them, and he grabs Megan, and he's strangling Megan. And so Dan is trying to get the corpse off, but they're so strong, he can't do it. So he takes off running down the hall and gets an axe, and he comes back, and he chops the arm off of this burn victim, pushes him out of the elevator. And the burn victim, the character who played the burn victim, was actually a amputee on his arm, so that's how they did that scene. Again, looks great, worked out just fine. So when they're in the elevator, Dan realizes that Megan has been killed. She was strangled to death, and he's upset. Of course, rightfully so. He's upset. So as they come out of the elevator, he's carrying her down the hall, and he carries her to a table and lays her down, and he starts doing the compressions and the paddles, and it mirrors, it bookends the beginning of the movie when he's at the very beginning, and he's trying to bring that corpse back to life, but he just can't. He's trying to do it, but he can't, but he wants to. He wants to bring them back to life, and he can't do it with Megan, and he's so upset, and he's losing his mind. And of course, they're all telling him, Dan, a good doctor knows when to stop. She's gone, Dan, she's gone, I'm sorry. So they all pack up, all the other nurses, they pack everything up, and then they leave. And, Dan is kind of there by himself, and, he's crying, and he's upset, and he's just kind of looking around. Then you see on his face, when the thought clicks in his mind, that he is going to use the reagent. He can bring her back to life, and she's fresh. So he basically, he just opens the bag, pulls out a syringe of reagent, and that's whenever he leans down to eject it into her brain, and the screen goes to black. And all we see is the glow of the green syringe with the reagent, on screen. And then, of course, it all disappears as if he's injecting it. And then we just hear a scream. We hear Megan scream, and then music kicks in, and we roll credits. And that is the end of Reanimator, which ended perfectly. I don't think that I really don't think it needed any sequels, to be completely honest with you. The sequels are enjoyable, but this movie is a perfect standalone film. We don't really see what happens to Herbert. We don't see what happens with Megan after she's brought back to life. We just don't know. And I love the way that it's book ended, just like it is in the beginning. Of course, without the pre-credits sequence, with Herbert and Dr. Gruber. So excellent ending, excellent film, great special effects. I cannot recommend this movie enough. I love it. Stuart Gordon is one of my favorite directors of all time. Like I said, earlier, I think I said that earlier in the video. All of his movies just have a really good vibe about them, and this movie really jump-started his career, especially with like Empire Pictures. So right after he did this, he would do From Beyond, Dolls, and so on and so forth, Robot Jocks. He did a lot of films during his Empire era, and he later on would do Castle Freak with Full Moon, The Pit and the Pendulum. Stuart Gordon has done a lot of films, and all of his movies just have this really just kind of nice vibe to them, is kind of how that's the only way I can really describe it. Dagon is another one that he did. I'll be talking about that one eventually. But this is definitely one of his best. And as far as, directorial debuts go, this is, by far, I mean, it's amazing, the things that he did in this movie. And like I said, that the way that he, kind of cut his teeth on this movie, and the way that he really kind of brought everything together, and he came from this play background, and he really learned to do everything on this film. I mean, it's just excellent, excellent movie. So that about does it for Reanimator. Like I said, it does have some sequels, but I will be covering next week. I will be covering the sequel, the true sequel, in my opinion, to this movie, which is From Beyond, which is, like I said, the movie after this. The reason I say it's the true sequel, of course, it's pretty much all of the same, cast and crew from Reanimator. which funny enough, Jeffrey Combs, I'm gonna say this now because I'll probably forget by the time I get to the From Beyond video. But Jeffrey Combs always said that he doesn't feel like he should have been in From Beyond. He said, played the character that he did in From Beyond. He thinks that it should have been Bruce Abbott. He thinks Bruce Abbott would have done a much better job. But I disagree. I think Jeffrey Combs does an excellent job as always. So. But anyway, that'll do it for us here tonight at the DVD Graveyard. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, stay tuned for next week. We're going to be covering From Beyond, also by Stuart Gordon. So anyway, until next time, stay tuned. Have a great night, and goodbye.